Justice Collaborative, and this is the first installment of our Blueprint webinar series for 2020. If you tuned in for our past webinars, you'll notice that this one is going to run a little differently. We will still be focused on our blueprint for a safer and more just America, which for those of you who are new is a comprehensive framework for national criminal justice reform that outlines concrete steps to address the country's mass incarceration crisis and provides actionable solutions to creating a fairer and more equitable justice system. And so instead of focusing on one particular area of the blueprint, we will be discussing an actor in our criminal legal system who can carry out many of these reform measures, local prosecutors. And so as we gear up for the dozens of 2020 prosecutor elections throughout the country, today our panelists will discuss the need to challenge both the public and journalists to push prosecutor candidates to work towards ending mass incarceration and mass supervision. We will also discuss the benefits and limits of relying on prosecutors to achieve transformative reform. And towards the end of the webinar, you'll hear from Molly Bernstein, our Associate Director for Volunteer Research and Advocacy, about how you can work to hold your prosecutor accountable. And so joining us today, we have a panel made up of some of my amazing coworkers. We have John Matthews, a Senior Legal Counsel with the Justice Collaborative, Kate Chatfield, Senior Advisor for Legislation and Policy with the Justice Collaborative, JOSIEDUFFY Rice, President of the Appeal, and TRUDY STRASSBURGER, Senior Legal Counsel and Team Leader with the Justice Collaborative. Thank you all so much for being with us. And as we start the discussion, for those of you tuning in either on Zoom or Facebook, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the comment section along with your name and where you're from, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. Okay, so to kick things off, the first question for all of you is the title of our webinar. And so what should the prosecutor's role be in reforming the criminal legal system? John, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure, I can get started. So everybody, my background, I'm a former federal prosecutor. And so I come to this having been on the side of the processing of human beings that ultimately end up in jails and in cages. And so to me, I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I'm really thankful for the Justice Volunteers at Loyola. We were talking about this the other day. One comment that struck me was that it's hard for prosecutors to reform themselves, right? So I think we need to, although the elected prosecutor is really important, what's really important is the movement, right? So people stepping up and talking about like what's important to them in the criminal legal system, because it's really about who the prosecutors are accountable to, right? So if prosecutors only feel like they need to be accountable to police unions and DA's associations and people who are about like locking people up for longer, then we're going to have the same problems, even if someone runs on as a quote unquote progressive prosecutor. So I think the movement is really important. And I guess to directly answer your question, I think the role of the prosecutors is to do less, right? And to envision ways to put less people in prison for shorter periods of time, and ultimately for the system to be dramatically transformed. Because right now we have a system that locks up way too many people for too long.
If I can just jump in too, I think like when we're talking about shrinking the system, it's also really important that we don't do other mistakes, like turn the prosecutor office into the giver of social services and the diverting people from jail, but still keeping people under the shadow of prosecution and jail and prison. So when we think about the role of the prosecutor in reform, in my eyes, it's really just shrinking the system and delegating what has been dumped on the courts in terms of mental health services and substance abuse issues to the agencies that are actually the experts of it and getting it out of the court system.
I would agree. And I think that in terms of when we're talking about shrinking the system, we're actually, I think in certain ways, asking prosecutors to do the impossible. Or to do something that's definitely does not come naturally to them, which is to be humble and to take a back seat and to reduce their footprint on the system and they've been elected and they have power now, and that's, you know, almost an impossible ask, I would think, of an elected official, to say, okay, now we've elected you, now do less, do a lot less. So I agree with exactly what Trudy said. So I think it's also incumbent upon us when we to not only look at the prosecutors, but to look at the infrastructure that has given them so much power, to look at who's in charge of their budget, look at those, you know, the mayor, or whether it's board of supervisors or county commissioners, to look at those elected officials and hold them to account for the prosecutor's actions and, you know, the resources that they are given. I think it's also very important to look at your state officials and what they are doing with your state's particular penal code that has given the prosecutors enormous amounts of power in the last 40 years. This is not always the way it has been. We have increased their power, and we need to pull it back. And your state legislators can do that.
Yeah, I would agree with what everybody said. I would just note that while we have the system that we currently have, right, while our criminal justice system looks the way that it does, it's very rare that you elect someone and then the best thing they can do is not act, right? Like as a professional, that's not actually really how anybody intuitively thinks about their work. Very often, the best thing a prosecutor can do is nothing. Very often, I'd prefer, and I think entire communities and an entire movement of people would prefer for them to be sitting at their desk and playing like Minesweeper or whatever games come with their computer over kind of constantly feeling the need to make themselves relevant by growing a system. And, you know, beyond that, like to Kate's point, prosecutors are elected officials, right? They serve the people, they serve their communities, they serve us. They're our employees. And so part of the key to really shifting what prosecution looks like today is shifting the way we think about accountability and who prosecutors are accountable to. Are they being transparent with the people that, you know, they work for? Are they giving us the, you know, do we understand why they make the decisions that they make? Is the calculus clear to the people who make the decision to elect them? So, you know, I think there are bigger things that they could do that also could restructure the entire criminal justice system. But even in the system we have right now, there are some basic tenets of how we, you know, view a democracy that they should be fulfilling.
Thank you. And to Kate's point, I guess we can kind of take a step back because you're talking about how, you know, they have so much power. Can we talk a little bit about what that power actually is? Who are the prosecutors? What can they do? Anyone can jump in.
Well, I'll just start and other people can fill in. I mean, the prosecutor, as we say in the law, they are in charge of the charging document. They control what charges are brought, what charges are not brought. They control whether charges are brought at all, or whether somebody is diverted at the very beginning of the process. They decide whether to request pretrial detention. They decide whether they're going to ask a judge to hold somebody in custody while the case is pending. That's pretrial detention, or to put somebody on electronic surveillance. They decide not only what crimes to charge, but what enhancements to charge. So really the sentence that somebody is facing is totally dependent on what the prosecutor says the crime is. Now, one crime you can charge, you know, I'm just going to take an example, a theft of a cell phone off of I'm here in San Francisco, so Muni, off of a bus. Somebody, you know, a kid steals somebody's cell phone. That can be charged as that grand theft from a person. Okay, that's a felony or felony, or they can charge that as a robbery, which is a strike. Okay, vastly different consequences for that young person because of the way the prosecutor decides to charge that act. They can, and then they decide what sentence will be sought and what sentence they will accept in plea negotiations. And obviously, if they charge a very serious felony or charge something as something, that could result in life without the possibility of parole, then suddenly a 25-year to life sentence looks like a reasonable offer to the person facing that life without the possibility of parole, let alone the death penalty. So massive, the most powerful actor in the system, more so than any judge, or more so than the public defender.
And I think too, we often forget that in most jurisdictions, the prosecutor also has a lot of civil power. So they'll prosecute parents to steal their kids or take their kids. They'll try to put people in jail for failure to pay child support. They'll try to raise civil asset forfeiture money to fund different parts of their office, which is, taking property from somebody who hasn't been even arrested in some jurisdictions. They often are a major player in smaller jurisdictions in terms of a county or city's budget, and they have a lot of control where money might go towards law enforcement or other services. It's very normal that the DA's budget is going to be one of the bigger line items, and the county's going to consider that first because they're considered, the most important for keeping us safe. They're going to have immigration policies in their offices, so they might be the people that are contacting ICE to report a status. They will report their arrest to, an employer sometimes. They will call ICE on victims. I mean, their power extends far beyond what we often realize because we don't see it and it's so behind the scenes. But when that arrest triggers so many other problems and issues, it's the prosecutor who's behind it all and really has the control to how it all is going to be affected.
Yeah, not only that, I think, and I agree with everything Trudy and Kate mentioned, but prosecutors are also involved in investigations, right? So even before there's an arrest, there's decisions being made often in partnership with law enforcement that prosecutors are involved in. So, and that's going to determine if there is an indictment, like who's in it, whether they're charged with all of it. And to Kate's point, because of the power with charging and overcharging, because most cases settle with pleas, most cases aren't going to trial, right? So it just has a huge effect on conviction rates, and how long folks are serving in prison.
Thank you. And kind of going off of what John just ended with, a question we got from one of our volunteers is, how prosecutors traditionally measured success contributed to mass incarceration, and what should the measure of success for a prosecutor actually be?
Yeah, I think prosecutors in many ways have measured success by what seems like a reasonable metric, right? How many times, in an adversarial system, how many times are you winning? How many convictions do you have? Or even how, has the crime rate dropped, or like what do the statistics show about a community? The reality is that that is antithetical to a system that considers people's humanity as they're going through the criminal justice system. You can't have a system that prizes winning when how you define winning is putting people away for the maximum amount of time and the maximum amount of penalty. And I think related to that, it has the fact that prosecutors have measured their success in this very transactional, very one-dimensional way has really warped the public's view in many ways of how what safety looks like and what a healthy criminal justice system looks like, because we draw a direct connection to how many people are in prison and how safe our community is. And we see, even when we see crime go down, we automatically assume that's because police have been doing their job or prosecutors have been doing their job. When we actually know that crime is complicated, that criminal, the way that we measure crime is complicated, that the crime rate is complicated. And so the problematic sort of incentives that have been set up by the way that prosecutors measure success have had, I think, far more reaching implications than just what happens in a prosecutor's office or even what happens in a criminal justice system. But it has shifted and I think warped the way that we all, or the public in general, thinks about the relationship between law enforcement and crime.
Just to follow up on that, Josie, I think too, even some government officials don't really, when things go wrong, they don't connect things to the prosecutors. Like jurisdictions who are dealing with an overcrowded jail, for instance, it takes them a while to get to the fact that it's the prosecutor who's asking for bail on everybody or insisting on county jail sentences, and that's the cause of the overcrowding. Like they scratch their heads and can't figure out why, when we just put a regressive DA in office and all of a sudden our jail is overcrowded. Like where's that connection? And I think it's something like we're all learning and figuring out.
And I think I just wanted to bring up an example to Josie's point. I mean, yes, the metrics have traditionally been winning. What's your conviction rate? And that's we have an 85% conviction rate or an 89%, or we're winning. But good prosecutors are starting to get not creative, but using different metrics. There was this, I just read about this restorative justice. It was a pilot program for 2 years in San Francisco's youth and children's system, the juvenile system. So they did a pilot program where they just randomly sent some children to a restorative justice program, pre-charging, didn't even, file charges on them, sent them to a restorative justice community-based program. There was a 40% reduction in recidivism for those children that went through the restorative justice program versus the children that were dealt with in the juvenile justice system, right? I mean, so even having contact with that juvenile justice system and having a probation officer and a conviction and having oversight, then it sort of entraps a person in the criminal legal system and can, in fact, lead to recidivism. And so versus just saying, okay, this was whatever you did, let's resolve it here. And then they moved on. Like they didn't have those future contacts, those future jail stays, et cetera. So I think there are very, very different metrics that can and that should be used. Unfortunately, what these metrics show is that any contact with the criminal legal system is actually, detrimental, in and of itself.
Thank you so much. And we're going to shift a little bit to talking about the role of the media, because for the most part, that's where we get 100% of our understanding about what local district attorneys do and how they impact the justice system. And so, Josie, this question is mostly for you. Like, what is your take on how well people understand what's actually going on?
In terms of how well people understand like what their local prosecutor does, I would say that the understanding has improved, I think, a lot in the past 5 years or so. When I started doing this job, there was nobody who covered prosecutors nationally at any major or really even minor news outlet, and now there are a lot of us. We have entire news outlets that just do that now. And I think people are starting to talk about their prosecutor more. They have a better understanding of the power that prosecutors have. That being said, like, this is an incredibly opaque system. It's really, really often illogical, even for people who are lawyers, right? You're constantly figuring out the extent of prosecutorial power. And that, I think, that goes for people who do this work every day, much less people who aren't particularly focused on their local criminal justice system. So the fact that there is more of an understanding now of what prosecutors do in the broad strokes, I think the details, to Trudy's point about the impact they have on civil issues, the impact they might have on immigration issues, like all of that, I think, is not totally clear to the average the average voter. And in general, right, like we don't pay enough attention, I would argue, to what happens in our local political systems. There aren't always, local media doesn't have the same kind of, I mean, it's not as powerful as it was even this time last year or this time 5 years ago, and we're seeing local outlets dry up left and right. And so the as we're seeing sort of more information about prosecutors on some level, we're also risking an increased loss of accountability on another level, which is that it's very difficult to cover the local prosecutor's office, especially if you don't have a legal background. It can often be very risky, and we don't have sort of the local journalism that we used to have to make sure that all 3,200 prosecutors, elected prosecutors in America have appropriate oversight, or that people who are voting them in have a real grasp on what they do in their power.
Thank you. And so then what do you think the role of the media should be in combating not only the lack of education, but just the difficulty in translating all of that information?
Yeah, so I think that the role of the media is enormous, right? This is that media should be considering it a moral imperative to cover local law enforcement and local criminal justice intently and scrutinize them in the way that you want someone with that much power to be scrutinized. I also understand that there are not always resources for that. And part of what we're trying to do for the appeal is help lift up and partner and fill in spaces where there isn't the same sort of local journalism infrastructure that there might be in bigger cities or bigger counties. But, we're still a fairly small operation, so we don't have someone in every county in America yet. I think the role of the media is interwoven with the role of just being a citizen in a democracy, right? Which is that, like, you have to support a free press. You have to support local press that does hold local elected officials accountable. You have to ensure that the people around you are getting scrutinized, and we have to make sure that there is a way for that to happen, which requires a robust media. And more specifically, I would say that, like, I mentioned that this is a very opaque system. Like, I remember sitting in crim law my 1L year and being like, what is happening? But, it's our job as the media to translate that opaque system to the people who are affected by it. Because what always I find particularly tough about thinking about the criminal justice system is how many people go in with no idea what to expect, what's happening, what's legal, what's not legal, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and they pay the price for that. And so what our job to do is to translate to, the job of the press has been for centuries to translate to people who are affected by people in power what the actual expectation should be and what that power should look like.
Thank you, and that actually shifts us to the next portion of this. So one of the benefits of having all of you here is that we can kind of give more meat to what the Justice Collaborative and the appeals theory of change is, and how we're playing a role in pushing prosecutors and candidates and other elected officials towards ending mass incarceration and mass supervision. And so you all come at it in a lot of different ways. And so if you could just talk a little bit about the work that you're doing, that'd be great.
I'll talk really fast since the appeal is kind of a side project. We're an independent news organization within the big umbrella of the Justice Collaborative. And I think the main way that we come at the need to address mass incarceration is through accountability and highlighting what the power that prosecutors and other actors in the criminal justice system have and what they're doing with that power.
I am part of the campaigns team. So we have a group of lawyers and communication experts that are assigned to different regions in the United States. Their job is to work with people who are on the ground, sort of behind the scenes, and looking at what the issues are in those communities that are really harming the community and helping them figure out a way to get that story out into the media and to put pressure on elected officials. and also really thinking hard and strategically about what policies and asks should be in place for prosecutors to reduce the incarceration or end mass incarceration in those places. So it could be anything from, you know, a community group wants to get a petition together because, like right now in Travis County, there's a woman who the lawyers believe are innocent, and so there's a team working with community groups on the ground to press the DA to drop the charges. To anything from a different place where the team might be looking at different social media and different ways of getting the word out about what kind of harm this certain policy is causing, and educate people about what a different policy could be. And sometimes it's taking like a really broad 10,000-foot view, and then other times it's really getting into the weeds about what a bail policy looks like, because we know that just one little exception means that the bail policy is worthless. And so we have to be really careful on that. So it'll be a little bit of everything. Yeah.
Trudy, can you talk a little bit about the Justice Guarantee and how that aligns with the work that the Justice Collaborative is doing?
Sure. And John and Kate, jump in because you're also working on it. The Justice Guarantee is a set of 6 principles that come from legislation introduced by Ayanna Pressley. And that includes things as after 10 years, somebody should have a meaningful opportunity to release, decriminalizing homelessness, making public transportation free, and I'm going to forget the other 3 because I don't have it in front of me. But hopefully Kate and John can work on that. The idea is to get a group of people across the country, community groups, elected officials, candidates signing on, and really having a discrete vision for what we could look like in a few years. Just ending mass incarceration is a really hard goal to have if you don't have a path to get there. So the Justice Guarantee is what gives us a path and gives us a way forward and can kind of unify our goals.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So a lot of the work that the advocacy teams do is local work, county level work, because mass incarceration was mostly built in these local systems. The Justice Guarantee, both the platform and the project, is also about broader narrative change, right? This idea that we're not going to have sustainable change throughout the country unless we're changing how people think about criminal justice or injustice and our relationship to all these systems. So yeah, Trudy mentioned some. So shift most first responder responsibilities, right? So the idea that in a lot of cases when people call the police, you know, say it's like a loved one or something happens, a lot of times police shouldn't be responding to those situations. It should be healthcare professionals, social workers, people with expertise to help solve the problem. I can't remember if Trudy mentioned decriminalize drug possession. I saw there's a question about that. And so, you know, provide cost-free substance use treatment and mental health care for everyone who wants it. Decriminalize homelessness, I think you mentioned. Fully fund zero fare transit, guarantee voting rights for every person, including people who are incarcerated, and provide a meaningful opportunity for release. Just given the fact that we have way too many people that are dying in prison because they've been there for 50 years, 40 years. And I guess to back up, I'm part of the general network, and part of what we're doing is helping to build relationships around the country, assisting with the local work, but also, you know, thinking about connecting folks across the country. And we really appreciate the work Justice Volunteers are doing, because our staff is relatively small. And so you guys are like really helpful just in terms of both informing us about what's going on in your counties and on your campuses, and also just helping to like be foot soldiers on the ground that are helping to push out these ideas. Because overall, when you talk to a lot of people, they still think about crime and punishment in a traditional law and order way that's mostly driven by bad media and bad movies and TV.
Yeah, and I'll talk. So I am working with building up our network of elected officials, whether state legislators or at the county level, and working with them. And also we have a policy team that's working on model policies for state legislation that can, reduce the impact of the criminal legal system in our country. But most of the work, as we know, that needs to be done is actually at the state level. It's not a federal problem so much as it's that each state has gone on this path together separately towards increasing incarceration, increasing the length of sentence, increasing the number of crimes, just giving more and more power to police and to prosecutors. So we're working to build a network of criminal justice champions who you have never heard of, some assembly person or some delegate in Virginia or, a state senator that's working on important legislation to impact their particular criminal legal system. So, and some of the justice volunteers are helping out, just tracking the state legislation, and we want to really raise up the best practices that are happening now. And as John and Trudy said, we're also pushing out to the electeds the justice guarantee, which really shows the intersection of issues like homelessness, transit, all of these things that are integral to a real public safety, like and a just society. That it's not just that too many people are incarcerated, it's that too many people are incarcerated and we're using resources for incarceration and not on housing for people that are living in our streets. So we're making these connections and seeing how it's related to dignity for everybody.
Thank you all so much for all of that information. And so we have actually a ton of really good questions that are coming in, and so I'm going to dive right into those. And so the first one is, I understand the notion of prosecutors doing less, but throughout our state in the South, residents are met with a sea of inadequate social services. The criminal justice system and the district attorney may be the only part of the equation that is adequately funded. A diversion program may be the only opportunity for an individual to realistically get drug or mental health treatment. Residents of historically marginalized neighborhoods of color often have little opportunity to succeed economically outside of criminal economy avenues, guns, drugs, human trafficking. Is a prosecutor with a platform and, if elected, a mandate for change supposed to do less when they may be in charge of the only resources that can transform communities?
So I also live in the South, and I think that there was a prosecutor elected in Dallas a year ago who provides a good example. He's probably not a model prosecutor, but on the issue of criminal trespass, what Dallas was facing was that when they looked at the numbers, probably 80% of the people arrested for criminal trespass, it was either at bus stops or on public buses or in the train system. And they found that of that, like a very, very high percentage also had mental health issues. And that the average length of stay in the county jail was about 30 days. While they're at the jail, they may be put on medications, they might not be. And then they were being released. The jail would give people car for bus fare and like their belongings. And the DA really looked at that and realized, like, these people are so much worse off from being grabbed out and put in the jail. And so we're providing services in the jail, like we're providing the medication and, they're in a warm place was the argument, but that's not right. And so he went to the county commissioners and said, police can arrest these people all they want, but they're going to bring them to me and I'm not going to dismiss the charges within 24 hours. And the police said, well, where are we supposed to take these people? Like, what are we supposed to do? We have to get them off the streets. And he said, well, we're going to be a little bit smaller in the office, so we don't need as much money as we had. Go build a housing shelter. And so he actually went through and looked at his budget and ended up pulling a significant amount of civil asset forfeiture money that had been designated to his office and gave it for housing. And now the idea is that the police, when they see somebody who has a mental health disorder and who's on the street, sleeping at a bus stop, instead of arresting them, they take them to the shelter where there are social services in place. I think that the prosecutor has to take a moral authority that what has happened is so wrong. And the idea that you have to be in a cell or under the thumb of a criminal justice system, and even the process of arrest, like what Kate was saying, we know that every night in jail you're your chances of recidivizing increase, that they have to use their moral authority and say, I'm not going to be complicit. And they have to go to their county commissioners and go to their city council and say, take money out of my budget, put it where it belongs, put it in Health and Human Services. This is just can't be my role. And it's really going to be incumbent on the city and the counties to figure it out. I think we're also looking at like the cost of a drug court, for instance, versus the cost of a center that people could go to receive substance abuse counseling on a voluntary basis is so much cheaper. Like somehow we devised this way of putting people in the court system to like get help, and it's incredibly expensive and it's not effective. So they have to be able to go and empower themselves with that knowledge and go to the other decision makers who have the budget and say, look, drug court's going to cost, X amount of dollars. It's not going to be nearly as effective. It's using up all this time. Take that money and put a voluntary program in. Then when police arrest people, or if they stop people, hopefully they won't even be arrested, the police can say, go to this place. And really it's the district attorney who has to demand, like, we're not going to take that money. We're not going to be complicit in treating people like this. We're going to use what we know the evidence shows, what we know science shows, and we have to change. And it's really hard. I'm not saying it's not a tough battle. Like in the South, we know that the jail is the biggest mental health provider. And for a lot of people, it's where they can go and they can get a prescription. It might be the only place in a lot of Southern towns where they can get a prescription for their medicine. And that's horrific. And I think it's up to the prosecutor to make that change.
I would just say budgets are priorities, right? And so it is true that like often it seems like the calculus of how to shift power away from prosecutors doesn't totally add up because we don't fund social services enough. And that's absolutely correct. That problem is not solved by continuing to rely on prosecutors to do that. And it requires prosecutors being okay with shifting budgetary priorities, but also like looking at your local and state elected officials in particular about where they drive money and what they're willing to fund. The reality is, like, if we didn't have a criminal justice system that was so comfortable locking people up because they're poor, because they're of color, because they have mental health issues, then we'd have to deal with the fact that our social services are underfunded because we have to use them. And right now, the fact that we use the criminal justice system as a crutch is actually preventing us from ever addressing this serious under-resourced nature of social services across the country, in particular in the South. I'm in Georgia, so whoever asked that question, I feel you. And it's a real problem, but it's not, prosecutors and, the local drug court might be a Band-Aid briefly for an individual person at this very moment, maybe, but long-term, it's a serious failure of our systemic priorities to address issues that we know don't require a cage with a cage. So it really requires sort of like looking at this holistically and holding all levels of people who have control over this accountable.
Thank you. Kate, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to answer, and there's a question on the side as well that I think relates to this, which is about doing, what is the opinion on decriminalizing drugs, or in other words, not prosecuting drug possession is what I'm going to assume it is, before harm reduction systems are in place. And maybe it's just repeating what Trudy and Josie have already said, but it's that the criminal system and the jail, that's not going to reduce the harm. That's not going to, if the harm reduction system is not in place, going through the court system and imprisoning someone in a jail, even for a couple days, that's not harm reduction either. And in many, many instances, what we call like collaborative courts or drug diversion courts or these specialty courts, I think often they are sold as an answer to substance use disorder. and that is somewhat of a public health response to substance use disorder, I would push back against that. I think they are often very punitive. They have the hammer of jail, over somebody's head if they don't abstain, if they don't, do this or do that. So I don't think at least when I'm talking about addressing it in a public health way, I'm not talking about drug court or some alternative to immediate incarceration and sort of, and continued supervision. So I guess, that's what I would say on that. But I think that it's almost a chicken and egg. While we're relying on the criminal legal system, we allow elected officials to get off the hook to say that, oh, we're addressing substance use disorder because we're arresting people and we're putting them in jail. No, that's not addressing that at all. And as long as they can say that and use that, they don't have to have a true public health response to, what requires a public health response.
Kate, relatedly, can you address Julie's question? She asked about shouldn't prosecutors be able to mandate treatment? Like, what about the fact that most addicts do not seek treatment and often return to drugs? Well, Kate or anybody, because this came up pretty often.
I'm certainly not a substance use disorder expert. So, I've had clients in these specialty courts in the past or these drug courts in the past. I found them not very effective in getting people better. I think the people that were going to get better would anyway, honestly, and that they weren't very effective in treating the issue. And again, I think it's this reliance on the whole system of we'll just send them to Judge so-and-so's court and it'll be taken care of and somebody will get better. And in my experience, that was not the experience of most of my clients.
Yeah, what I saw was I think a variety. Like there were definitely cases where you could describe them as quote unquote success stories, but I think when you balance them out of trauma that's associated with the criminal legal system itself, combined with the fact that a lot of judges and prosecutors also don't understand either substance abuse or mental illness, right? So you have this system where the moment, you mess up once or like, okay, I'm going to give you another chance. And then you mess up twice and it's like, all right, this is, I've had enough of this. Or say they give you 3 times, I've had enough of this, 3 strikes and you're out, you're going back to jail, right? Like there's not an understanding of the fact that like true addiction really takes a lot of time to heal and get over. And so I think that's part of the problem with it being housed or like using the hammer to send someone is that usually if they're not successful early on, then they just end up going to jails and prisons.
And I think the research backs it up. I mean, the research backs up this idea, and I mean, I'm not an expert either, but just I do read a lot about it. Like the research definitely backs up that people who want help are much more likely to succeed, and that they're also going to be relapsing, and they're probably going to relapse like up to 10 times. And those 2 factors don't fit into like a drug court or a court-ordered substance abuse program. And I think that there's a lot out there that it's like a square peg, whatever that metaphor is, but at the time when they were created, people were getting, like in New York, it was the Rockefeller laws and people were getting life sentences for bags of crack. And so drug courts seemed like a great alternative and the only way to avoid sending people to prison for the rest of their lives. But as things are changing, maybe that was just like a stopgap. And maybe now we can walk enough away from that we can stop using the court system to punish people for what we all know is a substance abuse issue or a mental health disorder. And we're criminalizing that behavior right now.
Thank you. And so another question we have is, What are some facets of the criminal justice system that have garnered local news attention? If we are working to change hearts and minds, what are some issues or talking points that have helped people's ideas evolve from the old law and order / mass incarceration ideology? How do we make sure we aren't simply preaching to the choir?
I have a quick response by way of a story to that question. And this is, so I was working on some legislation in California, and it was for felony murder. Okay, so felony murder, we were asking legislators to change the statute. So when you say the words felony, not good. When you say the word murder, not good. And so the quick soundbite is you're letting murderers go free, right? You know, the legislature is about to let murderers go free. So what we did is we had the family members come up one by one to the microphone saying, I support this. And they held a photograph of their loved one. This is my daughter. She's in, you know, she's affected by this. This is my son. This is my husband. This is my brother. One by one. It was like, you know, the look on the legislators' faces, they like, these are human beings. You know, we're not talking about murderers or criminals. We're talking about sons, husbands, brothers, family, you know, daughters, wives, mothers. So I think, you know, the best way is always to humanize it. And I think those are the best articles, in my mind, in the appeal, is when there's a story like this woman was, you know, is in prison for this, you know, BS forensic science, you know, and as a result, this happened, you know, or Rosa Jimenez, like this is a woman that is affected by this prosecutor's decision, you know, so I just think it's so critical to tell the stories of people. I mean, 50% of Americans have an immediate family member that is incarcerated or was incarcerated. I mean, so when they talk about, you know, that when the mainstream media is always about the police narrative and tough on crime and whatever it may be, I feel like you're a different 50% than I hang with. You know, that's you don't have a loved one affected. So I think that's sort of my short take is, you know, there are a lot of people affected and we need to tell those stories.
Yeah, I would say that like the stories that mostly get attention are stories where the stories about the criminal justice system going wrong that mostly get attention are stories where the criminal justice system didn't do enough. They didn't prosecute someone, you know, and that person got out. Or they didn't set high enough bail and that person got out. Or they didn't prosecute a police officer even. And what you see is even when it's situations that we would also find concerning, it's always that the criminal justice system didn't act enough. What we want to do is change what coverage of the criminal justice system looks like. I think the closest example I have would be, that feels very current right now, would be the Jussie Smollett case. With the Jussie Smollett case, which was a nonviolent crime, you hear people constantly saying that we don't want to focus on nonviolent crimes, we want to focus on serious issues. You know, you have a prosecutor there who is a former prosecutor and has been made a very, you know, had a major impact on crime in the city, and yet that's the case that got a lot of attention because people feel very energized and upset by someone not getting punished enough more than they do about people being overpunished. So what we're trying to do is not only humanize people and use different language and create a fuller picture of someone, even someone who has done something wrong, while also giving voice to the people who have been harmed. We're also trying to tell stories where the harm is done when someone overacts, not underacts.
Yeah, I mean, this is not directly a direct answer, but the language piece is super important. In every court, you hear defendant, criminal. The day Kobe and his daughter and all these people pass away, there are people already posting like, why do you guys feel sorry for this rapist, right? Like, so the idea that the worst thing you've done, that becomes you forever. Like, I think, and I think we're going to talk about a little bit about this later, is this idea of like what people can do. And part of what you could do is just challenge people's language on a regular basis, including like local media, and just calling people out on, I mean, some of the stories that came out of Kentucky recently, I was dumbfounded by, quote unquote left-leaning news publications, the language that they used.
And I think too, like locally, there's ways you can try to change the local conversation. I'd encourage your volunteers, you guys are so amazing, but you can draft op-eds, and I'm sure through us, we could look at them for you, and you can get the paper interested in an issue. You can think about letters to the editor when there's an issue that you think is not important, and kind of continue being that squeaky wheel about the stories that you want to hear. It may or may not have an effect, but you're trying to get the opinion out there as much as you can. Also, if you're on social media, like commenting on the story on Facebook or Twitter and starting a conversation with other people who are online about it and your point of view, can also, the reporters reading that, and you're helping change the narrative that way too.
Thank you all. So there are a ton of great questions, and we're running low on time, so this is going to be the last one, but I want to reiterate that this is just the start of the conversation, and we will be back every month to dig deeper into a lot more of these issues. And so this question is from Michelle Barad. We know there are issues with mental health being dealt with in courts, but there are other issues at hand that I don't feel are being discussed, including overcharging, prosecutors and public defenders working together to get often undereducated people to agree to plea deals rather than going to trial. Also, guilt by association laws, for example, looking like a gang member or association by proximity. And then she also mentions prosecutors' extreme discretion around what needs to be turned over to the defense, which can hobble a defense, especially for people relying on public defenders. How do we address these type of issues?
I think, so I'll just take a few of those. So yes, there's overcharging. I talked about that earlier, over at least the prosecutor's discretion. So we need to stop that practice of overcharging, and I think we stop that at the ballot box, and look at what prosecutors are doing. The gang enhancement, I want to point out that the new district attorney of San Francisco made a big announcement that he would no longer seek, on the campaign trail, that he would not seek to charge people with California's, it's called the STEP Act, gang enhancements at all. And he's ordered, and his first act was to disband the gang unit in the San Francisco district attorney's office. The Police Officers Association attacked him. They spent $700,000 against his candidacy. They called him a lover of criminals and gang members, and he won. The people did not buy it. So definitely things like gang enhancements, it's again, it sounds pretty dangerous, right? We don't like those gang members, but we push back and we educate people about what that really means, that is guilt by association, and only Black and brown people are charged as gang members, and it's a racist system, and we keep educating people and change can come.
And I think, there's all these issues in every jurisdiction. I think it's really important for y'all to look at your DA in your county and what are they doing that's causing so much harm. And whether it's a question of changing things at the ballot box or organizing a list of demands to the district attorney, just like you would to the mayor or a city council person to repeal a law or an ordinance, the same thing is applicable to DAs. For so long we've left them in their tower. And because they're not legislators, it's felt as if you don't have any power to get them to change. But they all have office policies, and we've seen with these reformed DAs that they can adopt really decent, good, strong policies that address and try to, ease prior harms. So I think a lot of it is figuring out what your DA is doing locally that is wrong, and either putting as much pressure as you can on that person to change, or finding someone to run against them, or really looking at the candidates and looking at their platforms and asking those questions and being involved.
That's exactly right. I mean, most of these folks are not used to being challenged ever. They've run unopposed. I mean, you have incumbents who've been in office almost 30 years, like most, more than some of our lives. So I think even don't underestimate your power and the ability to, raise issues and get people to pay attention, because in so many of these counties, nothing's happened.
So John, Kate, Josie, and Trudy, thank you so much for being on this panel and for sharing all this great information with our volunteers and for getting the conversation started about what they can do next. And to kind of wrap that up, Molly's going to talk quickly about how you all can get more involved with the Justice Volunteers.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kelly. And thanks to you guys, Trudy, Josie, John, and Kate, for sharing your perspectives and the work that you're already doing along these lines. Beginning of 2020 sort of marks almost a year now of Justice Volunteers, and we're really proud of all the things you all have accomplished in those nearly 12 months. As John just mentioned, I think something that's been particularly powerful about this group of people is that we've seen actions turn into impact over the past year in lots of different instances. And there are three main ways that we call on you as the Justice Volunteers to take action, although there are others beyond that as well. One of them is media amplification, which can be as simple as posting something to your social media. And this is really important because, like we mentioned on this call, sometimes just reframing something or attaching a personal story to a bigger concept can change someone's perception of what that is. Another thing is research. A lot of the criminal legal system operates the way it does because there's not a lot of information that's available. So a lot of our research team work aims at breaking down that lack of transparency. And then the last thing are actions beyond research and media amplification. That can be from calling and emailing your elected officials in the criminal legal system, particularly prosecutors, about things that are going on both in your counties and then other places in the country. I would like to highlight also, and as a Justice Volunteer, you've heard about this past week. One instance where we've seen this already take action just this week. There's a woman in Travis County, Rosa Jimenez, who has been incarcerated for nearly 17 years, and the district attorney has the power to release her. All evidence has pointed to the fact that she committed no crime. And so there's a movement now to call on her to release Rosa Jimenez and exercise the power and authority that she has to do so. So if you haven't already, please do sign the petition and allow your voice to be heard, and join us in the months to come in a really important year for making change. We'll be following up with you after this call and throughout the year.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to you all who are watching. If you have any questions following up on this, please email us at volunteer@thejusticecollaborative.com, and tune in for next month's webinar, which will be on solitary confinement. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.